Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953. Took position from Lenin as leader of the Soviet Union and raised a nation to compete with the United States for the world leadership. During the post-Russian Civil War, the father and two young sons were taken to the Red Army headquarters because they were accused of sympathizing with the pre-revolutionary authorities. Without listening or having any evidence, the commander shouted orders to execute. Through his character and actions, Red Army officer, Joseph Stalin could become Russia's dictator and regime leader that spread all over the world. For the people of the nation, the law itself, little by little Stalin's desire to give his photographs, appeared on the walls of schools, factories, and public places in Moscow, and even in small huts in Siberia. Stalin's photo was also found. There, the prisoners struggled to survive because they dared to criticize their beloved father and Soviet rescuer Stalin. Thoughtful and cautious, Stalin rarely appeared in public, and he knew only a few colleagues. With suspicion, even within his small leadership, Stalin ordered the assassination of a comrade who helped him rise to power without a hitch. In all his brutal repression, Stalin achieved remarkable success. Thousands work in agricultural cooperatives and factories. Anyone who dares to protest must be fired immediately or sent to prison in the area. Siberian ice. In 1941, Adolf Hitler's leading advanced forces arrived in front of every doorway of Moscow. As a national leader, Stalin mobilized the Russian people to make brave sacrifices and draw horror to stop the advance of the Nazis, which was unlikely to be suppressed, but his forces defeated the Hitler's force eventually. After the war, he ordered the rebuilding of his ruined territory. Later, with nuclear weapons, he began to compete with the United States, a pillar of the non-communist allies. It is true that Joseph Stalin was one of the greatest leaders in the history of cruelty, but his great achievements determined the lives of millions of people around the world. There are many stories related to him. Especially in personal life, he is still a mystery till this day. His real name is Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. He was born in 1879 in a small town near the Black Sea in Georgia, Russia. His first home was a rented house with only one small room and a basement. The furniture there includes a table with chairs, a bunk bed, a straw mat and an electric lamp. Family clothes were hung in a few streams against the wall. Cooking took place in the basement. A few years later, his hometown has become a national museum and attracts visitors from all over the world. Before Joseph was born, his mother's name Kik had already given birth to 3 sons, all 3 of whom died in infancy. That's why when Joseph born she took care of him without afraid of losing any physical or mental and financial hardship. His father's name, Bessarion, instead of making shoes that could not read or write and feed his family, he became addicted to alcohol and returned home to beat his wife and children when Joseph was 4 years old. He finds a job at a shoe factory in Tbilisi, 45 kilometers from Gori town, and he only came home occasionally. Joseph's father later killed in a fight in drink bar. To raise Joseph and her children, Kik worked as a tailor and laundress. She spent all his energy to make his son strong and confident. When he was 7 years old, Joseph, also known as Soso, had chickenpox. By the time he died, his face had a deep scar caused by chickenpox. Shortly afterwards, he was trapped in a cart, causing his left arm to serious injury. A wound that left his left arm 2 centimeters shorter than his right. His childhood friend later recalled that Soso, after years of being beaten by his father, seemed to be following in his father's footsteps, preferring to hurt others. At one point, Joseph dropped a brick on a burning stove, causing everyone in the room to catch fire. In sports or games, he prefers to threat the weaker child and wait patiently to find a way to defeat. The older and stronger children. Except for his mother, Soso seems to have no compassion for life. Soso's mother hoped that her son would become a pastor at the Russian Orthodox Church. She sent him to study at school which is sponsored by church. So got a special sponsored room, food, and fee and joined religious workshop at Tbilisi. In fact, So has no intention of becoming a monk. At the age of 13, he began to lose faith in God. Instead his hero, Koba, was a storybook hero who fought for the cause of Georgia's independence from Russian rule. Koba is a protector of the poor and desperate. He fought for revolution. By the time he was 18, he was no longer a believer in God. As a result, he was expelled from the religious workshop, but he was not offended. Without being able to serve God, he decided to dedicate himself to a new cause, was the revolution, the struggle on behalf of the oppressed poor, so he decided to adopt a new identity and even a new name, Koba. Formerly expelled from the seminary, Jugashvili, Stalin, was a staunch supporter of the German political scholar, Karl Marx, and his friend Friedrich Engels, the founder of the early communist system. For them, the whole history is a story about the rich, the oppressors over the poor. Both men wrote that the revolution will finally explode and the whole world will change, poverty will no longer exist and the world will become a paradise for workers. Joseph Jugashvili, Stalin, believed as a Koba hero, his special mission was to spread revolutionary ideas to the workers. Tsar, the powerful Russian emperor at the time, the first target to be ousted. Later a communist state could be formed for the benefit of all Russians. To achieve these goals, Koba tried to persuade the railway workers to strike. He organized a mass rally to protest in Tbilisi. When the cavalry stormed into the crowd and killed many of them, Koba rejoiced. He thinks the more the bloodshed on the protesters intensified, the sooner anti-government rallies and the overthrow of the Tsar were imminent. A few years later, Koba became an extremist worker for the revolutionary cause. In 1902 he was arrested and sent to a prison in West Georgia. Even in prison, he knew the internal divisions within the Russian Social Democrats, a faction of the party led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, saying that after the successful revolution, a new government would be led by the main group. Lead the revolution. That small group of leaders will make all the decisions for the workers' paradise. From the beginning, Joseph Stalin agreed with Lenin and the Social Democrats, later known as the Bolsheviks. Although never met, Lenin became the hero in Joseph's heart, nicknamed the Mountain Hawk of the upcoming revolution. Koba was sent to a permanent prison in icy Siberia for his revolutionary activities. He escaped from prison and later led a series of raids, including a bank robbery in the center of his hometown. After fleeing Siberia, he married and had a son. His wife was a woman in the revolutionary in Tbilisi. She respects So the most and considers him to be her destiny. So also loves her very much. Then, in 1908, about a year after the birth of their son, Koba's wife fell ill and died. He wrote, "She has softened my iron heart." One of the warmth and sympathy he once felt, seemed to disappear with the death of his wife. And since then, Joseph Jugashvili Koba has become ruthless, both to himself and to others, that he has devoted himself to his party Bolsheviks. He attends overseas meetings in Stockholm and London and finally a confrontation with Lenin. He wrote political books and published party's newspapers secretly. At that time, to avoid the police, he made a significant change. Using various names in his articles, he often referred to Stalin, which means Iron Heart Man. Stalin was arrested several times and sent to prison each time. In a prison, a prisoner forced to run between two rows of security guards standing on guns to beat any prisoners who did not obey. To show disgrace, Stalin walked slowly, clutching a booklet in his hand. Despite being beaten to the point of bleeding, Stalin did not scream or show any pain. Years later, the other prisoners still remembered his cold temper. Because of the activities in prison, his name became well known by Bolsheviks party members outside the prison. Despite his bad temper, many of the Bolsheviks still recognized his talent. At the age of 33, Lenin nominated him to the party Central Committee. In the summer of 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Stalin served one term in the Kuriga at the Arctic, Northern Hemisphere. When he has no chance to escape from Kuriga and return to a highly civilized zone, Stalin feared that his political career might be over. Later, in 1917, with the sudden outbreak of the revolution, things changed. A people's revolution erupted in Russia against Tsar Nicholas II, the head of state in World War I. Farmers and workers stood up in opposition because they were tired of the war that led to endless destruction. King Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and the middle-class liberals led by Alexander Kerensky took over the new government. Kerensky has pardoned all political prisoners. Stalin then traveled to Petrograd, where he was responsible for overseeing the Central Committee of the Communist Party until Lenin arrived there 3 weeks later. Lenin called for an immediate revolution to seize power from Kerensky and establish a communist government ruled by a communist council of peasants and workers known as the Soviet. The communists marched in the streets of Petrograd, waving banners demanding land for farmers, bread for workers, peace for soldiers, all power for the Soviets. An uprising failed, and on October 25, 1917, another attempt was easily successful. All power for the Soviets became a reality. Lenin appointed Stalin as a senior member of the 7-member party leadership, known as the Politburo, an organization responsible for directing the party's leadership. He was also one of 4 members of the Central Committee who have the right to decide all emergency orders. His role was head of the Nationality Department, which was responsible for uniting many different nations into the Soviet Union. But like other party leaders, he had to play a role in the military struggle to make the Soviet Communist government able to withstand the Allied nations. Those countries, especially Britain, France, and the United States, later tried to resist the Lenin Revolution and prevent the spread of communism to other countries around the world. In the bitter conflict that lasted until 1921, Stalin saw himself as the second most respected person in the world. Lenin is still behind only one woman, Leon Trotsky. There was a time in the city of Tsaritsyn, now called Volgograd, Trotsky demanded that Lenin withdraw from Stalin because of his strategic ignorance. To keep Stalin's face, Lenin sent him back to Petrograd by special train. Stalin never forgot Trotsky, who embarrassed him at Tsaritsyn. He also did not give up jealousy of Trotsky, a person who has never experienced a decline in power. On the other hand, Stalin never graduated college, and not a close friend had to be removed from public office. In addition, Trotsky was deeply educated, a great speaker, and even a great writer. In addition, Trotsky, whose real name is Lev Davidovich Bronstein, is a Jew. Like many Russians, Stalin hated the Jews. After Stalin met Trotsky, Stalin began to consider the communist Jews cowards because they did not like to use bloodshed as a means of conquest of power. As the Russian Civil War continued, Trotsky made himself even more famous. The Red Army conquered one after another until the end of 1921, when Russia fell completely into Soviet hands. The revolution was finally achieved. At the same time, Stalin remarried. This time his bride was 16-year-old Nadezhda Alelueva, the daughter of a Bolsheviks leader with a beautiful figure. Beautiful, well-mannered, she is completely different from Stalin, who has the right words and the right age to be her father. At just 1.72 m. At just 1.72 meters tall, Stalin realized that there was a spot on his face and that he was of Georgian descent. Even at a young age, she was able to work for Lenin, taking on the task of transmitting and translating messages. She often informed Stalin about Lenin's plan because of this important position. And in this way she did the most important work for her husband in the power struggle for the position of leader in the Communist Party. Within this struggle, there was much disagreement over the best way to build a communist force in the world. As expected, Trotsky and Stalin sided with each other in the talks. Trotsky says more freedom and democracy were needed in the Soviet Union as a model for other countries to follow. For Stalin, Russia was the only basis for the continuation of revolutionary activities around the world. Stalin, on the other hand, opposed the granting of more freedom to the Russian people. He believed in strict control and punishment of the people. Stalin said that communism would be firmly established in the hands of the only country of Russia. Later, other countries would follow the example of Russia, and gradually they would besiege capitalist nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, and eventually capitalism would be completely destroyed. When Lenin was alive and well, he was able to control and keep quiet between Trotsky and Stalin. But in May 1922, Lenin's cerebral hemorrhage ruptured, stroke, leaving him paralyzed and unable to speak or write. In the next few months Lenin just recovered, but no longer as strong and energetic as before in command to subordinates. At the same time Stalin used clever tricks to keep power by using friends to get him elected General Secretary of the Communist Party. But it seems a little late. Trotsky knew what was going to happen. Lenin planned to speak out against this arrogant Georgian native, Stalin, at a party congress, but in January 1924, a stroke again ended the life of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Before he died, Lenin made it clear that workers no longer trust Stalin. He writes Stalin was angry and this mistake could not accept the position of party secretary. Therefore, I suggest that comrades find a way to remove Stalin from this position and give it to someone who is honest, polite, and considerate to comrades. The day after Lenin's death, Stalin rushed to fire Trotsky from the post of Minister of War, and later forced this revolutionary hero to leave the country. Strengthened his control over the Communist Party and later over the entire nation. As leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin began to change the country. His goal is to move from a degraded agricultural country to a modern industrial power. To do so, he began building railways, power stations, and factories. Stalin built industrial cities east of the Volga and the Ural Mountains, using part of the labor force of prisoners. More than 50% of the workers involved in the construction of the industrial city have died of malnutrition and cold weather. Some workers were beaten to death or fined in the freezing cold. At the same time, some Russian farmers refused to leave the land or their farm to move to work in a new collection cooperative. Stalin used soldiers to transport the protesters by train to Siberia. There, with the cold weather, they were forced to build roads, canals, and railways. At the same time, their land was turned into state-owned collective farms. An estimated 10 million farmers died before the remaining farmers could join hands in integrated farming. The results of Stalin's program show that a declining agricultural society was transformed into an industrial nation. To speed up the process, he created a network of primary, secondary, and many huge colleges. But the cost of this success is very high. Again, Russia must rule as rigorously as before the revolution. Prisons and educational camps were found everywhere. From the window of his office, Stalin could see the terrifying cell of his secret police, known as Cheka, GPU, NKVD, and KG. KGB. Sitting in the position of a Tsar, he dared to pay for it. All the strength and desire to the Russian to follow his discipline. Stalin was always vigilant to maintain his power, which is why his secret police were on the lookout. They eavesdrop on telephone conversations and private conversations in public places. Incentives and rewards are given to any child who reports to police about parental criticism of the government. From the beginning of 1934, Stalin had to bring in the secret police to make regular lists of suspected enemies. Any name in the list, as Stalin noted, soon led to his arrest and execution without trial. His dictatorial character and his ferocity were reflected in one of his phrases that read, "In life there is nothing sweeter than revenge, watching the enemy, waiting for them, and after the execution, goes back to sleep." In 1936 and 1937, Stalin arrested and prosecuted many former Bolsheviks members and almost killed them all. Finally, in the summer of 1940, Stalin hired an assassin to chase Leon Trotsky in Mexico, where he was exiled. by assassins smashed the head of a revolutionary hero with a short iron rod. Stalin's wife, Nadezhda, begged her husband to stop the violent cleansing. When Stalin refuses, she threatens to divorce. Finally, after a bitter argument, she returns to the room, pulls out a gun, shoots herself in the head. Years later, Stalin visited Nadezhda's grave many times at night under the light, standing alone with his eyes fixed on her paintings carved into the tombstone. When Stalin overthrew the local enemy, he never forgot the danger posed by the enemy from abroad. Until 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, Stalin thought that Russia would be threatened by capitalist nations such as Britain and France. Hitler considers communism, especially Russian communism, to be his greatest enemy. Therefore, on August 23, 1939, a shocking world erupted, with Germany and Russia signing a non-aggression attack for 10 years. They also agreed to divide Poland into two. On September 1, Hitler began invading Poland, marking the outbreak of World War II. In need of a buffer zone to separate the Russian mainland from the Nazi army, Stalin hastened to send Russian troops to the Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian republics. Shortly afterwards, Stalin annexed these countries as part of the Soviet Union. In the bloody battle he also captured parts of Finland. At the same time, Hitler invaded the Balkan, occupying Romania and Bulgaria, all of which Stalin considered to be under his rule. Finally, on June 22, 1941, a group of German fleets. Another group carried out a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. 147 Nazi troops crossed the border into Russian territory. Unprepared, the Russian Red Army withdrew from all fronts for 2,400 kilometers. At first, Stalin was very angry because Hitler betrayed him. Later, speaking to the Russian people on the radio, he called on them to fight for the freedom of the motherland. He promised them that after the war Russia would have more freedom, and become a paradise for all citizens. But he set the condition that the Nazis be expelled and destroyed first. At the end of his statement, Stalin declared that the German invaders must die. Many Russians hate Stalin the most. In fact, they first welcomed the invading Hitler army, calling them liberators. But later they changed their minds when the Germans entered the village. They set fire to houses and looted property. They tortured women and children, and Russians were taken by the Germans as slaves in their factories. The Nazi assassins surrounded the Jews and shot them at the spot. German troops continued to advance for months. They eventually reached the outskirts of Moscow, but Russia still refused to give up. Then, in December 1941, Stalin pushed 4 million new troops into battle. He withdrew them from Manchuria, where Russian troops also faced Japanese attacks. When the Japanese bombed the port of Pearl Harbor, which also plunged the United States into war, Stalin hurriedly sent his troops back to attack the Hitler's army. German troops unprepared for the coldest weather. During the winter in Russia, Stalin's army had the upper hand in many battles, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. In Leningrad and Stalingrad, however, the Nazis were severely defeated. So far, the Germans felt that they could not resist the Russian forces and gradually withdrew. Iron-heart man Joseph Stalin stood alone as a hero at the time, a man who drove the Russian people from failure to great success. As World War II came to an end, the leader of the Allies, especially U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, hoped that Stalin would give up his selfish goals and turn to real and lasting peace for the whole world. But things did not turn out as expected. In an effort to rebuild war-torn Russian industry, Stalin sought to extend Russian influence to Iran, Afghanistan, Greece, Turkey, and Manchuria. With the exception of Yugoslavia, Stalin's armies took control of all of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. He helped North Korea invade South Korea, despite U.S. military resistance, and at least initially supported Mao Zedong's new government in China. At the same time, despite the growth of Russian industry, the people of the Soviet Union continued to live in poverty. They eat cabbage and potatoes, mostly as food. In the city, many people stay in the same room together. The press, radio, and television were tightly monitored, so the Soviets understood only what Stalin wanted to know. Secret police members are everywhere, creating an atmosphere of mutual fear and suspicion. Then, on March 1, 1953, Stalin's cerebral artery ruptured, and 4 days later Joseph Stalin passed away at the age of 73. On his funeral day, happy singing and dancing took place in the streets of Moscow as millions of men, women and children gathered and come to Red Square to pay their last respects. To this day, no matter what political beliefs, historians cannot refuse but acknowledge Stalin's great achievements. He made Russia a great military power and political ideology. Because of him, dams, canals, power stations and factories sprang up everywhere in the Soviet Union. It is true that these achievements came with the labor's camp, slaves, prisons, and torture were all vivid monuments for his leadership. Through the use of ruthless force, Stalin created a new kind of society. Like Nikita Khrushchev, one of Stalin's successors, one of the Soviet leaders wrote, "Stalin's personality was flawed and some of it was cruel." Khrushchev's interest may be a summary of Stalin's contribution to human history. Nikita Khrushchev, a successor to Stalin, one of the leaders of the Soviet Union. He was the first. Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, took position from Lenin as leader of the Soviet